It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's also nice to see some familiar faces here, or at least familiar names. I don't see everyone's faces on the screen right now, but thank you so much for having me. And we were just discussing earlier that, so many of the colleagues here are not too far away, just in Liège, and I'm in Maastricht. And so, but here we are meeting virtually, but still great to be here. So I'm going to share my screen and talk a bit about the linkages between migration and corruption today. And I know this might be a topic that is maybe a bit niche and something that perhaps not many of you have worked on before and might be a new interest. So the idea for today's presentation is really that it is just really an overview of several of the linkages between migration and corruption, which I think some of these linkages are very understudied, others we know more about. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about what actually corruption is, because we use this term and assume everyone knows what we're talking about, but it might mean different things to different people. Why should we care? And then I'm going to go through 10 specific linkages between migration and corruption. These are not the only possible linkages, but these are some of the bigger ones that I've been looking into more recently. And in some cases, I'll try to give some examples from research where we actually see this link coming out also. I might keep that to a minimum, though, just to make sure that we can get through everything, and I can bring up some of these examples perhaps later in the discussion also if there are questions. So first of all, what do I even mean by corruption? So here I want to think about corruption as something more than just bribery. I think often what first comes to mind for people when they think about corruption is immediately bribery. And yes, that is corruption. But if we think about it more generally or more simply, it can really just be understood as the abuse of a trusted position for personal gain. All right. And so this means, yes, it includes bribery, but it can include things like embezzlement, nepotism, extortion, and many other things. So if we break this down and, we can look at scales of corruption, for example, so you could have petty corruption, grand corruption, systematic corruption, where we see it in all levels of systems or institutions, whereas petty corruption is more like street level, needing to pay a bribe to get out of a ticket for speeding, for example. We can also have corruption in different sectors. Some of the ones that are most commonly looked at or most commonly known for maybe having problems with corruption are obviously like government or public institutions, like political corruption, corruption of the police, judicial corruption. But we also see this sometimes in education and universities, labor unions, even in healthcare sometimes. And there are a number of different methods of corruption. So again, we have bribery, embezzlement, theft and fraud, extortion and blackmail, really just in general, an abuse of discretion and maybe favoritism, nepotism, clientelism. So when we talk about corruption, I'm kind of including all of these things in the discussions around corruption. So why should we even care about this topic? Probably many of you saw the topic for today's topic and thought, oh, wow, I've never thought about that before. So we know that there's a very clear kind of negative link between corruption and development. We see that countries or areas that have higher levels of corruption or perceived corruption generally have lower levels of development. And lower levels of development are often associated with higher levels of corruption in many cases. And at the same time, we know that migration and development are interlinked. And then if we look at migration and corruption, we also can see that these links can also have an interrelated link, but with also migration and development. So in some cases, the link between migration and corruption can help development. In other cases, it can hurt development, and we'll go through these things through these different areas. But that's also why we might want to look more closely at some of the linkages between migration and corruption. So where does the link between migration and corruption fall? Do we see more positive links? Do we see more negative links? Well, we see both. All right, we see instances where migration can help to reduce corruption. We have situations where migration might increase or exacerbate corruption, and vice versa. We also, maybe have situations where we see different kinds of relationships, and we're going to go into each of those. So it's not straightforward just from the get-go. So I think this is it. In general, if we look at corruption and migration, now I'm talking right now on averages, okay, because I'm going to make some sweeping statements, and of course there are outliers and different things, but on average, countries where we see that corruption is perceived to be more widespread are more often countries of net emigration, whereas countries that are net immigrant countries are those that generally have, on average, lower levels of corruption. Now, again, this is just if we're talking about averages, but of course there are outliers. So just a quick reminder, where are the majority of international migrants located? All right, I just wanted to use this as a quick visual color screen. The darker the areas, the more migrants we know are in those areas. And then if we compare that to corruption across the world, you can see already some patterns that might be emerging of. So the darker colors here are higher levels of corruption or perceived corruption in the areas around the world. So the darker, the more red, the higher the corruption, the lighter, the more yellow, the lower perceived corruption in general. I should be clear that there's no country that has zero corruption on every level, but we know that it's more pervasive, perhaps in some areas than others. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is some work that was partially started by myself, Jorgen Carling, and Erlend Pasha. And in one paper, we actually, did some regression analysis looking at where we see this relationship. And again, we have this kind of loose relationship between migration and corruption, where we do see, again, that more people are leaving high corrupt countries and more people are going to lower corruption countries. So obviously migration brings together people with different backgrounds and perspectives and varying ideas about what even constitutes corruption. So corruption maybe doesn't hold the same definition or have the same feelings in different country contexts. And, what we can also see is that there might be differences in how corruption is perceived in countries of destination compared to the countries of origin or communities of origin. So it's really possible that people transfer their ideas about corruption to new locations, but it's also possible that people start to take on new ideas about corruption when they go to different destinations. So we're going to go into 10 linkages between migration and corruption. Some of these also are a little bit overlapping, but we'll first look at how corruption can facilitate illegal or irregular migration. We'll look at how corruption can then also enable the protection of refugees, how corruption can impede the development benefits of migration, how corruption can stimulate migration desires, how corruption can promote the transnational ties of elites, how corruption can discourage return migration, both in the short and long term. And obviously then this can feed back into impeding the development benefits of migration. Then we'll talk about how social remittances, though, can help to reduce corruption, and how migration can also help to change or upend corrupt social structures. But also then the flip side, how it's possible that migration can also sustain corruption. And finally, how corruption can also undermine assistance to migrants. So let's first jump in and look at how corruption can facilitate illegal migration. And I think this is the area that's had the most research, the area that is the most known within this connection. So we know that circumventing laws and regulations is really the key motivation for bribery in the field of, and in the field of migration here is no exception. So corrupt officials can produce false documents. They can turn a blind eye to human smuggling or trafficking, or they can shield also employers of any penalties with regard to having illegal or irregular migrants. corruption almost always plays a role, some kind of a role in trafficking. And it definitely can stand in the way of orderly migration management. And it's by far the most widely acknowledged connection between migration and corruption. And yeah, there's often the discussion that it, so-called greases the wheels of the transnational trafficking industry. So through plenty of research, this is just one example, we know that this is very much the case, for example, in Nigeria, where we know that there's a well-established system of human trafficking for prostitution to Europe, especially coming from Edo State. We know that corruption here is happening through many different layers of the government, and a lot of people are getting rich from this. So it's not just border guards, but it's also people in very high governmental positions that are helping to make this happen and making money from it. So there are a lot of financial advantages for people beyond the traffickers themselves, as I said, public officials, but also those who are tasked with immigration control in transit and in destination locations also. So trafficking can almost never happen without some level of corruption at often multiple points in the migration journey. Maybe just one quick anecdote. So I not only do a lot of teaching, at the bachelor, master's, and PhD level, but I also do a lot of trainings and capacity development and capacity building with government officials, international organizations. And I do also a lot often with border guards and immigration officials. And many from African countries, but also other countries. And once I was visiting some former students that were border guards in Ghana. And they were telling me a story of something that happened just recently when someone who was very obviously a trafficker to them was trying to leave Ghana via the Accra and the airport. And so my former student, it was clear he had girls with him, whatever, and he had come back and forth. They could see in the system already, 10 times that month. So he said, this is obviously raising red flags. This is a problem. And he detained the person. And the person told him, I'll give you $2,000 right now to let me out, because within 24 hours, I'm going to be out anyway. And well, at least my former student told me that, well, of course, he didn't let him out, but within 24 hours, a call came from someone much, much more senior that this person should be let out. And so they had to let him out, and the person was actually traveling to Germany. So what my student did then was call the German border guards and say, this person is about to come through. I'm quite sure this is a person who's trafficking people. It would be in your best interest to detain them. And the person was detained in Germany, sentenced to 7 years in prison, and then apparently also had an outstanding warrant in Belgium also, and then would be transferred to Belgium after serving the sentence also in Germany. So, these are, everyday occurrences of things that are very, very obviously happening on a regular basis. And even border guards, off the record are very willing to talk about them. So obviously that is the very negative side of migration and corruption, right? But we have a other kind of completely flip side that is more positive, in that we know that it's often very difficult for people with a well-founded fear of persecution to enter Europe. Because they often don't have the documents that are needed. We can talk about also Fortress Europe. So in many cases, corruption plays a role in actually allowing people to get access to putting in an asylum claim who have every right to do so, but don't have the ability to get physically in the right place unless they, some kind of corruption mechanisms are used along the way. So, we know that most professional human smuggling services really are very dependent on corrupt officials, and they often also offer the safest routes when corruption is used with border guards also. It's quite paradoxical that people basically have to break the law to get access to security, access to something that they deserve. Then we can look at how corruption impedes the development benefits of migration. And this is in a number of ways. So we already know through plenty of research that migration can help to alleviate poverty, help to facilitate development. We know that remittances and investments by migrants and, development initiatives of diaspora groups all help with development in countries of origin. If we also think of development multidimensionally here, not just by monetary poverty, but access to education and healthcare and better living standards, all kinds of things. So this potential that we know that is there can definitely be undermined when migrants' money is tapped into by self-enriching people in trusted positions in origin societies. So basically, when migrants or their families or their remittances are being targeted for corrupt practices, this is problematic. And this can happen in a number of ways. So for instance, if people are sending money back to start businesses or investment projects, if bribes are required for construction permits, licenses, planning permissions, then it's likely that migrants are going to be less willing to invest in those things in the country of origin. So, similarly, if remittances are targeted for extortion, the incentive to send remittances then are reduced. And we've done some research on this, which I will come back to. Sometimes also we know that corruption can block the reintegration of highly skilled returnees and obstruct knowledge transfer. So an example of this is if nepotism trumps merit in the hiring practice, or if corrupt practices prevent professionals from being able to put their knowledge to use, then you can see that it's, that the corruption situation is really inhibiting these really positive benefits. Honest, and in most cases, highly skilled returnees are motivated by a desire to make a contribution to their country of origin. But if they have a lot of obstacles in the forms of corruption, then it can be really demoralizing. And we often see that people really give up to some extent on some of the ways that they would like to contribute. So just some evidence or some examples of this. We've done some research, some quantitative research using the Latin America's barometer. And here we looked at if remittance receivers were targeted for extortion in a number of countries. So we looked also specifically at police bribes. So the idea here was if remittance receiving households were more likely to be asked for bribes. Not necessarily pay them, but if they were asked for bribes. And we do find evidence in some countries, but not all countries, that remittance receivers are more likely to be asked for bribes than non-remittance receivers. So we think that this is working through a signaling effect, because in most local communities, it's quite clear who has a migrant abroad and who is probably receiving remittances. So that's kind of a signaling effect of more available cash in the household. It's just like if someone is known maybe for being more rich or whatever, that then it's more likely that they'll be targeted because it's clear that they can draw on more resources. We've done something similar also using the Africa barometer. And again, we looked if international remittance receivers were more likely to pay bribes to get a document or a permit, or to get water or sanitation services, or to avoid problems with the police. And it is very clear in this research that remittance receivers are paying more bribes. Now, what is not clear here is whether or not they're being extorted, or whether or not they're using their available income to make their lives easier through corruption, right? So with this data, we actually can't determine which side it is, but it's clear that remittance receivers are paying more. So then we can move on to whether or not corruption stimulates migration desires. And we can do this, we can look at both direct and indirect effects here. So obviously the the desire to move abroad is often driven by the lack of faith in local opportunities, and corruption and nepotism in particular are perceived to undermine meritocracy, and turning towards opportunities elsewhere is really a plausible reaction, especially among the highly skilled, to especially specific types of corruption like nepotism in the countries of origin. So that's a kind of direct effect. Indirect effect, though, is that we know that corruption has all these other knock-on effects, right? So corruption can hamper economic development. It can undermine the rule of law. It can make it more difficult to access good education or healthcare. So there are a lot of these kind of indirect ways that corruption could also affect migration desires. So here we see kind of the direct ways that it can happen. So, you know, through, if people are unhappy with corruption in the police or, you know, the political sphere, education or whatever, but it can also happen through the lack of then access to healthcare or human security or all of these other areas. So in our team at UNU-MERIT, we actually did a study for GIZ, for German Development Cooperation. We set out a theoretical framework looking at the links between corruption and migration, which can be applied to different country contexts. And we used a human security approach to do this. I'm not going to go through everything, but this is the human security framework, right? So it's looking at really multidimensional areas of life, from economic to political to health, the environment, et cetera. And this is just an example where we showed how corruption can directly impact kind of push factors for migration, but it can also, for example, in economic security, it has a lot of mediating effects and can affect a lot of other things that then would affect reasons why people might migrate. And this is kind of a joke to show you, but we did it for all of the, I don't expect you to be able to read this. So we did it for all the different human security areas and tried to show all the different ways in which corruption could end up affecting migration directly and indirectly. And you can just see that there's a whole web of possibilities here. So the next thing we'll look at is how corruption can promote the transnational ties of elite. So what we know is that in countries that struggle with high levels of corruption, there are few at the top who stand to benefit from developing transnational connections. So these are really the people who are, this is usually in a high inequality context. So the people at the top can make more, have access to more migration, have access to more transnational ties because of their positions. And their earnings, often from corruption, can make international migration even more possible, especially maybe when they're coming from states that their passports usually don't make it very easy for them to travel. So we know that corrupt elites also have particular motives for transnationality, and often not only put themselves, but also their wealth outside of the country. And sometimes they do that to also prepare for a quick exit in case they get in trouble in their own country. We also know of examples. So in China, you have what is also called naked officials, and they're called naked officials because they're in very senior positions, working and living in China, but their families are generally in another country. And we know that there's also a lot of corruption around this, and a lot of the resources are sent outside of the country. And then if they get in trouble within China, they have an easy exit to go outside of the country. So also coming back to similarly the how corruption can reduce the development benefits of migration, we can also see this with regard to return, both short-term return and longer-term return. So particularly if migrants have adapted to less corrupt societies in the destination countries, then even the corruption that used to be there before might be a reason for them not to return after they've gotten used to a different situation. So you see this in many different cases. It might just be things from, for instance, I've had students in the past who told me they didn't want to return home anymore because every time they have to cross the border at their country, the border official asks for a bribe just for them to enter their country because they know that they're living abroad and assume they have more money, right? So this stops even just short-term returns for people to visit their families when they get extremely annoyed by these things. But for more long-term settlement, corruption can also substantially complicate the process of establishing and running businesses, and makes economic integration more difficult. So, it's really also about those investments upon return and trying to reintegrate economically. So, yeah, in some, especially post-conflict situations, also, we know that corruption can disrupt property restitution mechanisms or reintegration assistance, and then discourage also refugees from returning. So these are the processes of being able to gain access to land that people left when they fled the country, or maybe specific return programs where people should be able to get access to assistance, but depending on who's implementing the assistance, maybe they actually don't get access without doing some kind of additional favors. So this can be really problematic, especially when we're already talking about, traumatized or more vulnerable populations. Maybe I'll skip this, but we have some evidence also on this, issue of discouraging return migration, not just in developing countries, but also in developed countries. We did some work with Italian academics whose reason for migration did not have to do with corruption, but once they were in other countries where, for instance, nepotism wasn't so prevalent, they said that they would never return to Italy to work again after understanding how the situation could be so different in another country. So social remittances can also reduce corruption. So obviously when migrants retain close ties with their countries of origins, we know that there are social remittances there, right? They regularly transmit norms, values, know-how, and part of this can also be with regard to corruption. So since migrants move on average from high corruption countries to low corruption countries, they can develop a more critical view of corruption practices and contribute to spreading such kind of anti-corruption norms in their communities of origin. It is, of course, also possible for migrants in high corruption countries to bring corrupt practices with them to destination countries too. We need to be aware of that, and that it's not only a rosy picture. So yeah, this is just a visualization of this. So then we also have what I would kind of coin, what I would say as also possible morality drain. All right. So in this case, we have country A, let's say it's a high corruption country, someone who is unhappy with the corruption situation in the country, maybe nepotism, whatever, is really frustrated, decides they want to leave the country and go to a lower corruption country, right? So this is on social remittances, but that means that the people who are often left are those who maybe are okay with the status quo, or on average are more likely to be okay with the status quo. So that can already reduce the likelihood of a change in the country. However, the flip side of that is then migrants who may have left the country because they didn't like corruption, but also maybe not just for any other reasons, gaining new ideas about corruption and then sending those back via social remittances. So these transfers can also happen in a number of ways. So yeah, the migrant could have migrated because of corruption, but not necessarily. They can also transfer purposefully or unconsciously. And a lot of this depends also on the migrant characteristics themselves. So they can transfer these things via communications, short-term or long-term return visits. And those, on the other hand, can also receive this information purposefully or also kind of unconsciously. It also depends on the receiver's characteristics, whether or not these things actually stay within them and cause any changes. And it can change the perceptions of corruptions and the desire to reduce corruption, right? So these are two different processes and don't necessarily go hand in hand. Just because someone's perception of corruption changes doesn't mean that they're actually going to do anything about that. So there are a number of examples of these. One of the seminal works that actually looks at this, looking at immigration, remittances, and corruption, is by Iveles and King. And they used the Gallup Balkan Monitoring Survey. And what they find is that migrant households are actually more likely to face bribe situations and be asked for bribes by public officials But at the same time, if they have relatives abroad, this reduces the probability that they'll actually pay the bribe. So they're more likely to be targeted and asked for the bribe, but also less likely to actually pay it, which is really interesting because you can kind of see possibly two mechanisms at place. One is the signaling mechanism, but the other one may be also social remittances happening at the same time, which is quite interesting. Then I'll move on to how migration can also upend corrupt social structures. So we know that migration can also often transform societies of origin and, not least through remittances, social remittances, return. And, where we see that migration can change power through people who now start to have more access, more networks, more capital, we can see that power structures within the country can also start to change. And maybe migrants that now have more power start to demand different structures and try to change different structures. And we do have plenty of evidence for this over time and around different parts of the world. So I talked already about morality drain, where the key issue here is the selectivity of migrants with, migrants basically voting with their feet, saying, I'm unhappy with this situation here, so I'm going to leave. Yeah, but that really, leaves just those behind who are maybe more corrupt or maybe more ambivalent to the situation. We've also done research looking at this, and we do find some evidence that people who are more targeted for corruption and say that they are unhappy with a corruption situation, so you need both of these things, they're more likely to have plans to migrate in the future. So this gives a little bit of evidence to this idea that there could be some of this quote unquote morality drain happening. And finally, there's the issue of corruption undermining assistance to migrants. So I've even already spoken a little bit about this on return and access to assistance there. But we know that highly corrupt settings, especially, there are situations that migrants can be challenged in a number of ways. So one is corruption can directly undercut program effectiveness. So funds are embezzled or diverted to bribes or depleted by, inflated procurement costs, et cetera. And we have several examples of that in Afghanistan, for example. Also, prospective beneficiaries might be disappointed by the assistance delivery and may attribute this to perceived shortcomings to corruption in situations where they're already in a highly corrupt environment. It might just be bad implementation, but immediately often the beneficiaries think, oh, this is because it's corruption. Someone is doing something else. Another mechanism is when actually anti-corruption measures become so overly cumbersome that they start to divert resources away from their effectiveness, also in some country contexts. And then we know that there are also plenty of situations where only by knowing someone or being in good with someone, that's only when you'll actually get access to the assistance. So for example, we know in a lot of situations where, social protection programs or things like that are implemented at the local level. Often the local level that's doing the implementation are people from the community. And then if you're a friend or family member of those person, you're more likely to get access to the assistance. So it's clear that migration and corruption have effects on each other. Some of these effects can be unpredictable and sometimes contradictory. We know that corruption can be reduced through some mechanisms and sustained through others. It can fuel migration desires directly or indirectly, but it can also increase individuals' ability to migrate despite restrictive policies. And this, we already have the migration and development nexus, and then adding corruption in there adds another layer to this migration and development nexus. So, concerns of migrants, destination communities, and societies of origin, really often need to emphasize the importance of fighting corruption, but corruption is often systemic, and some approaches, point to corrupt officials as bad actors and to blame them for the hardships of migrants, but we need to be careful in the different contexts. And another very important point, which has come up in a lot of our research, is that migrants view their experiences also of corruption differently from case to case. Sometimes something that we, let's say in the West, would consider something as corruption is just considered everyday business in another country context. So we also need to keep these things also in mind. I know I'm a little bit over time. I'll stop there. If you're also interested in more on migration and corruption, but many other topics, feel free to also visit my YouTube channel. I was discussing that also just before the seminar here. I do have a YouTube channel that covers all different kinds of migration topics with new videos that come out each week. And for those of you that are also teachers or practitioners, it can be really useful in a classroom setting too.